Hello, my name is Ori Givens. I'm the Director of Communications for the New York City Anti-Violence Project. Welcome to Courageous Conversations by AVP. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, what we call at AVP Intimate Partner Violence Awareness Month. This is the time where we highlight the experiences of LGBTQ survivors of intimate partner violence and raise awareness about violence in our communities. We're joined today by a panel of experts to discuss a topic that can have a big impact on LGBTQ survivors seeking support. Did you know that New York has a mandatory arrest statute for cases of intimate partner violence? That means whenever the police are called, someone must be arrested, and often who is the survivor and who is causing harm may not be obvious. This results in misarrest and further victimization in our communities. Today, we will talk about this statute, the implications, and what LGBTQ survivors need to know in New York State to stay safe. For our first conversation, I'm joined by legal and policy experts to shed light on this statute and what it means for our communities. Shugrue Santos is AVP's Deputy Executive Director of Programs. Leslie Allen is AVP's Deputy Director of Legal Services. Erin Ross is the Program Manager and Lead for the Disrupting Gender-Based Violence Project at the Vera Institute for Justice. And Julie Goldscheid is a professor at law at CUNY Law School. Thanks so much for all of you to join us today and for having this really important conversation. Let's get started with a definition and understanding of what mandatory arrest is. What is it? Why do we have it in New York? And is New York unique from other states? Erin, let's go ahead and start off with you.
Sure. So mandatory arrest, to explain that, I want to explain to you what the authority is for police to make an arrest. So the police have the discretion, the authority to make an arrest if they have reasonable cause to believe that a crime has happened. That's how every crime is treated in New York State, except for cases that involve family offenses. So a family offense would be a crime that occurs between family members, related by blood, share a home, marriage, children in common, or intimate partners. For cases like that, the police actually have a different law that they have to abide by, and that's mandatory arrest. And that means that the police are required by law to make an arrest when they respond to a scene involving a family offense. And almost every family offense kind of falls under that requirement. And so that requirement applies to felony cases. They apply to misdemeanor cases as well. In misdemeanors, the police are required, they must make an arrest unless there's what we call a cross complaint, or when two people make a complaint against each other that a crime has occurred. Then the police have what's called a primary aggressor provision that they have to follow, which means they have to kind of figure out what happened. Whether they're looking at like the history between the two, the extent of the injuries, whether there was self-defense. Then the police aren't required to make an arrest, but they still have the ability to make an arrest of both parties. But ultimately, the kind of takeaway there is that crimes, the police have the discretion to make an arrest. They assess the situation. They use the evidence to decide if an arrest is appropriate, if they have reasonable cause to believe that crime happened. But when it comes to family offenses, they are required by law to make an arrest.
And there's some history that goes along with why this statute is in place. Julie, Kat, would one of you like to shed light on kind of the history of this and why we have it here in New York?
Sure, I can get us started, and then Kat, you can follow up. So, the mandatory arrest law in New York was really part of a wave of statutes around the country that were enacted really starting in the mid-'80s in response to a few things, largely in response to the fact that law enforcement at the time widely didn't take domestic violence seriously. The typical response of a police officer when called to what is still called a domestic is to tell the alleged offender to go walk around the block. There was this view, still is, that intimate partner violence is a private matter, shouldn't be a matter of public concern, shouldn't be something that is taken seriously. And in response, advocates started urging mandatory responses. You have the police not responding. Well, okay, the policy response is let's make them respond. And there was at least one study in the 80s that seemed to indicate that would be a helpful thing. That study has not been replicated, but nevertheless, it started a wave of statutes being enacted around the country that required police to respond. And it's very problematic. I mean, we can talk about the many ways. So I'll turn it over to you, Kat, if you want to weigh in.
Sure. So again, I think as Julie said, the intent was to ensure that survivors were able to get support from systems that were not seen as responsive or really fully understanding the scope and the breadth of what intimate partner or domestic violence meant, or how serious it can be, how deadly it can be. I think at the time as well, there was a sense that law enforcement and systemic options were the only remedies that could really stop this violence from occurring. And at the time, forcing those systems to respond seemed like the right thing to do. It seemed like the right way to support survivors. I think we've learned since then to really understand that survivors of violence, they know what they need, and they know what safety means for them and how best to get it. And so imposing mandatory remedies from legal systems that may not feel safe to them or they may have experienced harm from isn't really the way to go. And to just be clear, what mandatory arrest does is take the agency away from the survivor and put it in the hands of police officers to make a split-second decision in the moment of what to do. And so I think now we understand that we should be looking to survivors to tell us what builds safety for them, as opposed to telling them what makes them safe.
That's really good insight and background from both of you. Thank you. And I think one of the things, especially during this month, during Intimate Partner Violence Awareness Month or Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we always want to make sure that we're uplifting the unique experiences of LGBTQ survivors. And particularly with this issue, there's some uniqueness to the dynamics of LGBTQ relationships that might cause problems when we're talking about this context of mandatory arrest. Leslie, could you shed some light on that and talk about how this law can disproportionately affect survivors in our community?
Happy to. So what we just heard a little bit about the history is that the history of this law really wasn't focused on the LGBTQ community at all. It was focused on heterosexual couples, and it really was advocating for survivors of domestic violence in a very sort of stereotypical way of there being one sort of like very innocent, abused person, very likely to be a woman who's being abused by a man. And so if we create this law, then the police will come in and they will get the bad abusive man. What you see in queer relationships and LGBTQ relationships is that the police can't apply that framework they've come to rely on in determining who is the aggressor. And so what you have, well, you have a few different possibilities of what can happen. One of the most common, most troubling ones is that the LGBT community is often subject to dual arrests. So whether or not a survivor decided to call the police in order to get de-escalation help into their home because they felt unsafe, or if a neighbor or community member called police because they heard an argument taking place that they thought was concerning, the police come in, they see an LGBTQ couple, this doesn't fit a normal script, and the result is that they end up arresting both parties, which is deeply traumatic for anyone. And the numbers are really dramatic for these impacts. So if a couple is has the police call on them and they're both male presenting, then they are 52.8% more likely to both be arrested. And for women, or female presenting people, the number is almost as high as 39.1% as likely. And so really the lived experience of the LGBT community on how this law has operated is dramatically different, and it's clearly negative, because I don't think that there is a real rational argument out there to say that having these domestic disputes end in the resolution of having two people arrested is positive. That's not how we create safety.
That's a really good point. And we aren't just necessarily speaking of LGBTQ survivors experiencing more impact. Other marginalized groups can also experience impact because of this law. Can someone share a little bit more about that? And particularly how those intersecting identities may present challenges for survivors in this space?
I think one of the things that we see a lot of AVP, because the majority of people that AVP serves and supports are LGBTQ and HIV affected people of color. And we see that the intersecting identities of being queer or trans or non-binary, and often being a person of color, perhaps also being an immigrant, can put you at a juxtaposition with the police where you actually trust police less. And you may also be subjected to other forms of bias directly from police, or implicit bias that makes you more likely to be arrested. So we see this frequently where if we have an interracial couple, the partner who is a person of color is more likely to be arrested. And so understanding that also, when we know that trans people, queer and trans people, face higher rates of violence when they are detained, when they are incarcerated. We also hear partners saying, yes, I want the violence to stop, but I don't want my partner arrested because I'm afraid of what's going to happen to them if they're arrested, because they're a person of color, because they're a Black person, because they're a trans person. And so I think recognizing those intersecting identities is really important, and recognizing that for many survivors, that police intervention does not actually equate with safety, it equates with additional risk. And so a mandatory arrest law that requires arrest, that requires intervention, actually escalates risk for them as opposed to decreases risk for them.
So we've talked about how this mandatory arrest statute was intended to cause action upon the part of law enforcement, but seems to have a lot more negative repercussions in the community. I'm curious if this law does actually reduce violent crime against survivors. What information do we have on that? Maybe Julie, Aaron, can you weigh in?
I can get us started on that. You know, the data, so it's national data, really shows that there isn't a correlation between arrest and reducing the likelihood of future offenses. So it's really kind of ironic, painfully ironic, like tragically ironic in a way, that, you know, there was this move to require police intervention with the idea that it would produce safety. And like at least this one study that seemed to indicate maybe it does, but that just those studies haven't been replicated, and it certainly isn't the lived experience. So, you know, the studies show that arrest really doesn't have a significant impact on the likelihood of reoffending. In fact, there are some studies that suggest, just like Kat was saying, studies that bear that out in truth, you know, in lived experience, that arrest increases the likelihood of future violence, as well as increases the likelihood of violence from other sources like law enforcement and some of the violent harms of being system involved. There's also some troubling results in the research showing that a partner's arrest for domestic violence increases premature death for victims, particularly Black victims. So this isn't about necessarily partner homicide, but death from other causes. So I think we really need to take that in when we look at the impact of a law like this. You know, the fact that a national study shows that it increases mortality, particularly for Black survivors, is just really troubling. You know, and I'll just add that the New York law was enacted, and it does something called sunsets every 2 years. So, you know, that should mean that there's some opportunity for review and consideration and evaluation about whether or not the law is meeting its hoped for goals. And, you know, that should provide an opportunity for us to really step back and look at the impact of this law and think about whether it really is advancing safety or whether some other approach should be taken.
Yeah, and to add to that, you know, when this law was enacted 30 years ago, whatever the intentions were around that, we're in a different place today. We understand what arrest does to people, to families, the impact, the stress, the burden. You know, mandatory arrest statutes like this were meant to take the burden off of survivors. And in reality, it's adding more burden onto their lives. Before I came to Vera, I was a prosecutor in the Bronx, and I specifically handled domestic violence cases. And that arrest was not the end, right? There were a slew of things that a survivor would have to deal with on top of the stress that they were already dealing with at home, whether it be health, economics, violence, all of these issues that they were dealing with. Now they're dealing with a criminal case. And as we were talking about before, there are many situations where not only were they having to deal with the case of potentially a partner, somebody who is bringing money into the home, now they have a criminal case. The survivor themselves also have a criminal case that they have to deal with if they're arrested. And there were plenty of times where both parties would be arrested, or the person reaching out for help or who actually needed help was arrested. And this is just adding more stress onto people's lives. And for a statute that's renewing every 2 years, that's sunsetting every 2 years, we need to do a good job of evaluating what that impact is and how it's really impacting people's day-to-day lives before we just allow statutes to kind of renew over and over again. We're in a better place. We know the harms today. We know what people are experiencing when they're interacting with the criminal legal system, both as a survivor of a crime and as somebody who's accused of a crime. And we just need to do better.
Absolutely. It seems like we've moved so far in our knowledge about this subject and our knowledge about criminalization and the impact of incarceration in the carceral system that we're looking for new solutions. I want to ask you all, are there any alternatives that you've seen, legal or otherwise, to support survivors in a better way than mandatory arrest? Are there other states that maybe have better ways of handling this, or better ways we could do it here in New York State?
I think that AVP really, we pride ourselves in our work in being survivor-centered, survivor-led, really. And so what we do is partner with survivors, people who are experiencing violence in their relationships, experiencing parent control dynamics, and find out what they want, right? We use a harm reduction approach to say to them, what do you want to shift? What are your resources? What do you need more of? What do you need less of? And we do a pretty deep and extensive and often repetitive experience of safety planning with them, which is very unique to each survivor, so that survivors can mobilize resources they have. We can help connect them to resources they need, so they can seek, if they want. Many survivors don't even want to leave a relationship. They want the violence to reduce. So thinking about programming like AVP offers to support people causing harm in changing their behavior.
Julie, Aaron, do you have any thoughts, Leslie, about what we could do alternatively instead of this statute?
So I definitely have a few thoughts. One point to note is that states without mandatory arrest statutes do not have a domestic violence grassroots push to institute mandatory arrest. This is no longer seen as a good solution. It's no longer the sort of policy that is tied to violence against women funds. And now domestic violence advocacy organizations and federal efforts to improve the survivor experience are much more focused on education and training of police on domestic violence issues, creation of specific police task forces, people who focus and take pride in working with families and understanding domestic violence dynamics, and not focusing on this incarceration aspect. I worked in domestic violence for 7 years in Pennsylvania, and while the agencies that I worked for were often pushing on the local police department or on the state legislator to institute a wide variety of policy, mandatory arrest was not one of those, because the problems are just known. It's time for New York to sort of modernize in this way.
And I'll add to that just to say that the studies seem to show, I think you're suggesting this, that states with discretionary arrest laws have reduced spousal partner homicide rates. So, I mean, that's also something to take into account. But to your question about alternatives, there are many, AVP is certainly one, and there are many community-based programs that center the survivor in the way that you all were talking about, in identifying services, providing support, providing counseling, helping with, people connect with the economic and other resources that might help them, helping them figure out how to manage a relationship if they want to stay in the relationship. There are a lot of things being done on the grassroots level. And I'll also say that even back in the 80s, there were survivors who were calling for more community-based responses. They tended to be Black women, other women of color, other people of color, who were calling even back then for community-based responses. And there were some community-based responses, but I think it's important for us to note that there was a whole turn to making a huge investment in the criminal legal system in a way that we find ourselves today, hopefully less so, but where the default response, the predominant response and the default response when people are concerned about intimate partner violence is to turn to the criminal legal system. But I think it's really important to note the really important advocates who even back at that time were calling for alternatives. And so now, it's important for us, I think, to lift up those alternatives. And it is good to see the shift in resources at the federal and hopefully at the state level to support more community-based responses that can be focused on ending violence and helping keep people safe without having to turn, certainly as massively as we had, to the criminal legal system.
Absolutely. I know that's something that we definitely champion here at AVP, is really centering those community-led solutions, those community-informed, survivor-informed solutions. Before we wrap up this really great conversation, I just want to take it back to Kat one more time to give some insight to survivors who might be listening and might be navigating this. What do you suggest? What should survivors, LGBTQ survivors, do if they find themselves in a situation where they feel like they may need to involve the police or are experiencing intimate partner violence in their relationship? What would you suggest?
I think the first thing that I would encourage a survivor to do is to know that they're not alone and they can reach out for services. AVP has a 24-hour hotline, which we'll share. And so they can always talk to someone who can actually talk through safety planning with them and thinking about, do you want to call the police? If you do, what's the plan to be safe while you're doing that? What do you need to think through, right? There are, Julie mentioned, there's a lot of community-based resources across the city and state. In every county, there are programs that would support survivors, and there's a statewide domestic violence hotline. For LGBTQ folks in particular, I would say giving AVP a call as an initial idea is a really good one, because we can help connect folks with LGBTQ specific or inclusive programming across the state. And we would be happy to talk with them directly to help them plan, thinking about who can they turn to, who knows about their relationship, who have they disclosed their LGBTQ identities to, who will support them, who understands these issues, where could they maybe go stay to get some safety. We also can help them with safety planning around financial issues as well. Very often the parent control dynamics in an abusive relationship extend to economic abuse. And so we can help them think about how to safeguard their personal information, their financial information. So I think really talking through their unique situation and just having someone to talk to and know that they're not alone, I think is really key as well.
Absolutely an invaluable service to be able to connect with advocates to talk through these issues that both understand the dynamics of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, but also understand the unique needs of our community. This has been a really great conversation, everyone. Thank you so much, Kat, Erin, Julie, and Leslie, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. We're going to talk also to AVP's Director of Legal Services, Ashley Young, about more support services for LGBTQ survivors from our legal team. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Courageous Conversations. Now, we're continuing this important conversation about the impact of mandatory arrest on LGBTQ survivors. Joining us now is the Director of Legal Services at AVP, Ashley Young. Ashley, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start out by first talking about how you've seen this rule affecting our community.
Sure. I'm glad to be here. Thank you. So in our work, we work with survivors of all types of violence that are members of the LGBTQ or HIV affected communities in New York City. So the impact that we see on the mandatory arrest laws are vast. We see clients coming to us saying that they were falsely arrested because they were not the aggressor in the situation. However, when police respond, they might not know who the aggressor is because they haven't been trained in identifying maybe a same-sex relationship or a trans person, and it's challenging their norms and their understanding of intimate partner violence. And those impacts on our community are so vast because not only are you getting the violence and the danger of being arrested and put potentially behind bars for a long period of time, but you're also getting that trauma and lack of understanding from the community that you've called for help at that point.
Yeah, it seems like you're getting, re-victimized, as they say. You're experiencing the first trauma, and then you're experiencing it again, trying to get help. And we know that this has effect on many different groups, but especially our undocumented community. Survivors who are also undocumented may face an increased risk with this mandatory arrest paradigm. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. As we know, survivors in our community are facing so many intersecting barriers and intersecting identities that can all be part of marginalized communities that are going through different biases, lack of understanding, hate in general. So when we see our survivors that are undocumented come and ask for support, sometimes they might need support and they might want to call the police, but they don't think they can because the other partner might be the provider in the family, or they might be taking care of children, and they might fear that that person would then be arrested. So that's actually, the thought process is this will be good because we're getting this abuser out of that home. However, in effect, it can cause a really chilling effect on survivors from calling because they're looking for protection, not necessarily having the partner or ex-partner be arrested. And protection can look different and safety can look different than just one way of achieving safety, which is a mandatory arrest. There are many different ways to provide safety. Sorry, I was just going to continue.
Absolutely, go ahead.
In addition to that chilling effect on survivors, legally, the significance is huge because we have filings for U visas, potentially VAWA petitions, that it needs to be disclosed if there have been any arrests made, and that can affect a person's chance of getting citizenship. So whether they're the aggressor or the victim in the situation, a lot of immigration proceedings are all wrapped as partners, wrapped together as family. So if one person in that partnership is arrested or one person in that family, it can affect the applications for not only them, but everyone else. So it can really affect the status of being able to stay in this country, to get work authorization, and to be able to survive, really.
That's really interesting. I didn't even think of the fact that because these petitions oftentimes, you're bundled with, whoever you're in a relationship with, no matter who may be affected or who may be arrested, it could affect the status of that petition. I think that's really important to know, and just generally important to know that this issue can have such a dramatic effect on somebody's ability to stay in this country and sometimes even stay safe in this country.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
curious, because we do, as you said, help our survivors with all different kinds of things. Tell us more about what our legal department can do for LGBTQ survivors of violence, particularly those who are experiencing IPV, and what programs and services we have.
Sure. I would encourage all survivors who are members of the LGBTQ or HIV affected community to call our hotline. We have a 24-hour English Spanish hotline that has text capabilities as well. We also have certain walk-in hours on certain days of the week. You can check our website, avp.org, to find the up-to-date information on how to contact us. But the hotline will really connect you to all of the services that AVP has to offer, not only those crisis intervention services, counseling, economic support, support groups, but also our legal services department, which of course I think is amazing. And we work with survivors of all types of violence. And in particular, for intimate partner violence, we work with people in the family courts, and all of the boroughs will help folks get orders of protection. We can even help navigate the criminal legal system as a victim of crime. So if there's any criminal case that's been filed for a person who's been abused, we can also help them just understand what is happening, what these words mean, what the rules mean, what to expect in that process. So we also do housing support. We help with discrimination claims if you want to file to the New York Commission on Human Rights. We really offer a holistic approach to our clients. So if they come to us expressing any legal services needs, we try to be creative and really problem solve and take care of all of the legal matters that that person could have, or at least try to help them find support for those legal matters.
Thank you for that, Ashley. I think those are such vital services that it's important for community to know about, that are available free of charge, that we can connect people through with our legal team. I wanted to also know, since it's Domestic Violence, Intimate Partner Violence Awareness Month, I'm curious to know, from the perspective of legal, what are maybe some of the things that are important for folks to know if they are experiencing intimate partner violence or have somebody in their life that may be experiencing intimate partner violence? What are some big things that, from your perspective, communities should be aware of?
Mhm. I think first and foremost, if you're experiencing intimate partner violence, or you know someone who is, or um, you want to be a support for that person, first and foremost, I would say it's not your fault. It's not that person's fault. I think it's something that creates a lot of fear and shame in people when they're going through these situations. So it's hard enough to take that first step and reach out for help. So I would say knowing that it's not your fault, you didn't do anything to deserve this, is first and foremost, and that there is resources and help available. It's a priority for us at AVP to tackle intimate partner violence within the community, because it can be so overlooked and misunderstood by, what you would call traditional service providers. So the expertise in this field is something that is really important at AVP. And so I would just encourage anyone to reach out for help, support, and know that we are here.
Absolutely. I think one of the unique things about AVP is the dedication to really uplift and identify the needs of LGBTQ survivors of this violence specifically, and really work to design programs and support systems and change outside programs and support systems to help support our survivors. One more time before we go, Ashley, I'd love for you to pitch our hotline and let people know how they can get in contact with us.
Okay. So we have our 24-hour English Spanish hotline, and let me make sure I have the number correct. I'm going to hold it up. It is 212-714-1141. So if you need any support, we offer that crisis intervention on our hotline and access to all of our other amazing services at AVP.
Absolutely. Ashley Young, our Director of Legal Services, thank you so much for joining us and talking about our legal program.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
And we want to thank you all for watching this renewed Courageous Conversations. We invite you to follow us on social media at Anti-Violence and to visit our website at avp.org for more information and resources, including our resource page on LGBTQ intimate partner violence. For all of us here at AVP, I'm Ori Gibbons. Be safe and be well.